In this example, I want to look at Express.js, and specifically I want to take Express.js and look at Express.js as kind of a whole Node.js framework. And in order to do that, I'm out on the Express.js website, and there's a getting started part where I don't know that we're going to get a ton of help there, but under the Express generator, what the Express generator will do is it'll generate kind of a template application for us. So I'm going to the Express generator, and you'll notice that there's a couple of things that we can do. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install the Express generator. So I've already done that, and one thing that I didn't mention when we're doing these installs for Node.js and using npm, the -g flag means that I'm going to install this tool globally. So the Express generator I want to install globally on my machine, and then additionally I have installed NodeMon so that I don't have to constantly stop my web server and restart it. I installed that globally as well, and again that's going to come into play here. So I've already done this Express generator install, so now you should be able to see these commands. So if I just use express-h in my terminal, you'll see the various versions that I get. Okay. What I'm going to want to do is I want to generate my first application. So you'll see the syntax for this is I'm going to use express, that's the command. Then I have to define the view template, and by default the view template that most people use is Pug. And earlier versions of this were called Jade, but they had to rename it, so Pug is a view templating engine that we'll look at today. And then the name of your application. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and generate a new application. So I'm in my development folder, and I'm going to issue the command express. I'm going to set my view equal to Pug, and then the name of my application is going to be Express generated application. Okay, so it created that application, and then I'm supposed to change my directory, so it gives me kind of a checklist of things to do. So I'm going to change my directory, I'm going to install the dependencies, and then it says I can start the application. I'm going to use NodeMon to start the app. Okay, so it's just going to be NodeMon and then start. So I'm going to change my directory. I'm going to do my npm install. So this is going to get all the required dependencies that I need. And then because I've installed NodeMon globally, I should be able to do NodeMon start. Okay, and what it's going to do is it automatically will start your application on port 3000. So I'm just going to localhost :3000, and you'll see what we get is an Express application. Welcome to Express. It doesn't look very significant or anything like that, but what I want to do is I want to use that generated application to get into some of the concepts that are going to be really powerful with Express and Node.js. And specifically, those concepts are, how do I use that MVC design pattern? So we'll get into controllers and views. We won't necessarily deal too much with models because we're not going to be connecting to a data store or anything like that, but we certainly could with MySQL or a different kind of NoSQL database. That's certainly possible. And then we'll get into view templating as well. So how do I deal with controllers? How do I deal with view templating? And then lastly, I want to get into this concept of routing and how could I have different routes within my application if I'm going to build this out. Because right now the template that they give you is not necessarily very full-featured, but that's okay. It kind of gives us an idea of what's going on with Node and Express. So I'm in Atom. I'm going to add a project folder, and I'm going to add the project folder that we just created, which is my Express generated application. And you'll see that it generated a few things. So it generated app.js, and you'll see that this looks more complicated than what we're necessarily used to. It generated a few views for us. It generated a few routes for us. It has this public directory, which includes our images, our JavaScript, our style sheets. Our node modules is what we used when we installed ran the command npm start. And those node module dependencies came from the fact that we have some dependencies listed here in package.json. I think this is probably enough to get started. So when we start our application, we're really going to app.js. And what app.js says is really we're looking for a route. Okay, so let's kind of walk through step by step how we're actually rendering our initial page. Okay, so within app.js, we have this app.use/index router. And index router, if I look up above, it's really a reference to that index routing file in the routes directory. Okay, so index router is coming from here, from that routes file. So I'm kind of pointing my cursor at that JavaScript file where it's coming from. And then it's saying, if you encounter a path called /, you should use that index router to determine how to handle that user's response. Okay, so let's go to that index.js in the routes directory. And you'll see what's happening is it's saying we're going to require Express, and we're requiring the Express router. So whenever we're handling routing, we're going to require the Express router. And what the router can do is it's going to say, okay, you've given me this path. You gave me this path, and basically you're not giving me a path. You're just saying at the root of that directory, so at the root of our website, then I want you to run this function. So the function right now is kind of an old school function. We can rewrite that to a modern function using arrow syntax. And what's happening is we're saying with the response, go ahead and render index. And we're passing in some data. The data that we're passing in is a title equal to Express. Okay, I'm going to change the title to Brian's demo. Okay, so I'm changing the title so the data changes. And what'll happen is you'll notice if I go actually refresh the page, it says, okay, we're looking at Brian's demo. It changed in the title. It changed in what looks like this H1 tag, and it changed in this welcome message. What's happening is we've looked at the response, and we looked at how you can send data. So there's a send command. There's a response.json. So if I wanted to send JSON back to the client, I could certainly do that. In this case, we're using response.render, and what render does is it actually renders out a view template. Okay, so in this case, we're rendering out the index view template, which is this guy right here in my views, index.pug. Okay, so this is what's actually getting rendered. It's saying this view file, go ahead and render it. Okay, so let's look at index.pug. Okay, so pug syntax is based on indentation. Okay, and we're getting into a little bit of pug syntax right away, but essentially we're saying extend the layout. Okay, so the layout is kind of like the base template for all of our views that we're going to have. And it's this layout.pug. So we're saying using layout.pug as a starting point. So we're going to have an HTML page. We have a head section with the title. We're linking to our public style sheet, style.css. So we're linking to that style sheet. And then we're saying, here's a placeholder where you're going to put content in. That's what block stands for. Block says you're going to have a placeholder called content, and any pages that use this layout file can then substitute their own content for this block of content. Okay, so if I go back to index.pug, you'll see that block content referenced. So basically what we're doing is we're cutting and pasting this stuff into our layout file. That's how I'd read this. Okay, so if we have Let's go ahead and open both of these files. Well, it's annoying that it's closing both of them. I want both of them open at the same time. There we go. So I have layout.pug, this is our starting point, and then index.pug extends that layout, and we're supplying content in that content section. A couple of notes about pug. So now that we know that we're using that layout file as our starting point, and we're just kind of substituting content in for the section marked as content, the way this will work is we don't have that HTML tag syntax for pug. Okay, so we're not going to have beginning and ending angle brackets. All we're going to do is we're going to say what tag we want, and then the corresponding text. And arguably, this could be written a little bit different. So this is the syntax that I will typically use. And what this syntax is indicating is that I want to interpolate a variable here. Okay, so what's happening is that this template file is getting a variable called title, and I'm interpolating the value of the title and outputting that corresponding value. Okay, now you might be thinking, where does this variable title come from? The data, where does data come from? So if we go back over to our routes, you can see that I'm passing in data. These are known as locals or local variables. I'm passing in a variable called title, which has a value of Brian's demo, and then in index.pug, I'm rendering out that title that I passed in, which is Brian's demo. So I have an H1 tag with Brian's demo in it. I have a paragraph tag with welcome to Brian's demo. And then also, if I look at the layout, you'll see that the title is also matching Brian's demo. And again, they're using syntax that I wouldn't necessarily use. I would typically use that # curly braces to render that title. Okay, and I've made those changes. I've made a few changes, but you'll see that it doesn't necessarily affect anything. So I have the title. You can see it in my tab. I have this H1 tag, and then I have this paragraph tag. And I always find it helpful when we're looking at templating engines to make sure that we're getting what we expect. So here's my H1 tag, here's my paragraph tag. I might want to pass additional data in. So if I go back to index.js, I have a title, which is Brian's demo, and then I might want to have an ID being 17, just for randomness sake. Okay, so I have a new piece of data, which is ID, the value 17. I'm passing that in, and that's coming over to index.pug, and specifically, we start with the layout, and then we go from there. I might want this paragraph tag to have that ID attribute. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I could do, but mostly what I'm going to do is if I want attributes, I'm going to use these parens, and then I can say ID is equal to, and then instead of using the # for attributes, we actually have to go both ways. So if I want it in text, I use the # in curly braces. If I'm inside of an attribute, I have to use JavaScript interpolation. So I'll use those backticks and then $ID. Okay, and the ID is coming from the data that was passed in. Okay, so if I refresh this, what you'll see now is that my paragraph has that ID of 17 that I passed in. Okay, so I'm able to embed that. I'm also able to embed classes. So for instance, this H1 tag, right now it's just a generic H1 tag that has Brian's demo in it. If I wanted to assign a class, I could assign a class like MATC heading. Okay, so I have a class identifier that will now be associated with that H1 tag. I could have multiple headings, advanced JS heading. And what that'll do is it'll make it so that there's multiple classes associated with that H1 tag. I can do the same thing with IDs. So if I decide I want to have a div with an ID equal to container with some text, Okay, what's going to happen is I'm going to have an ID of container with some text nested inside of a div. If I don't specify div, div is the default. Okay, so even though I don't have a div, Pug is going to default to having a div. Okay, that's the default HTML object that we're going to be dealing with. If I wanted something inside of this div, so right now we have some text inside of the div, I might decide I also want to have a couple of span tags, or maybe I want nested divs. Hello world. You can see how I have those nested divs. Okay, and some text is not in a div right now, it's just inside the initial div tag. So if I actually wanted it to show up as a div, I'd have to put it on its own line, and I'm losing some, and you'll notice what happened was that it said, oh, you want some to be a tag? So it's going to render out those elements if they're indented as HTML elements. So I wanted this to be some text, then I have to have div equal to some text. Okay, so I always like to bring up the developer tools so that I can kind of see what's going on as we're getting into these demos. If you're not comfortable with the Pug syntax, but my guess is that you'll be really kind of quick to catch on to the Pug syntax. The one thing I will say is some people, this is indentation based. So some people like 2 spaces, some people like 4 spaces. I prefer tabs. It doesn't matter what you choose, but stick with a style in order for this to work. So it's indentation based, and if your indentation doesn't match, then your Pug view template is not going to work. Okay, so kind of moving forward from view templates, right now our router is saying anytime we get a request to this URL, let's go ahead and run this code. So we get a request response next. I'm actually going to get rid of the next. That really has to do with middleware, but you'll notice that it doesn't really change my demo. So I got rid of the next because I don't really want to get into the middleware quite yet. So if we get a request to our homepage, we're going to render our homepage. If we get a request, so I'm going back to my app.js, if I get a request to users, then I'm going to go to the users router. Okay, and I should see a different file. Okay, so what we're really seeing here is I should be able to go to users, and you'll see respond with a resource. That's not necessarily all that helpful, but what's happening is if I go to the route, you can see that I'm just going to the base of users. Then I just go ahead and send respond with a resource. Well, really what I could do is I could say, okay, I want to create a new file, users.pug, and I want it to extend my layout, and then I want to define a block for my content. Okay, and I'm just going to have an h1 tag, user content goes here. And now if I refresh this, you'll notice I'm getting the same response. So I have the view template set up, and the reason I'm still getting the same response is if I go back over to my routes, I was sending that response. What I really want to do is I want to use that response to render a specific view template. So the view template that I want to render is users. And I actually don't have to send any data along. Okay, so ideally I'd send the title along because you'll notice the title right now is just /users. So I get user content goes here. My title is still just users. Ideally, I would send a title. And the reason I say that is because if I go back to the layout is expecting a data piece, which is the title. And right now it's just using the default title of the path, the URL path. But if I did pass a title along, then it would render that title, users homepage. Okay, so now I am passing along data, and now you'll see that it shows up as the user's homepage. Okay, so let's define our own custom route. Okay, so I want to define my own custom route. I want to have, if I go back to app.js, I want to handle the fact that users may go to the admin directory. And I'm going to call this my admin router. And the admin router is meant to be an object that I don't have defined yet. Okay, so I'm going to want to do that same thing that I did up above for the users router. I'm going to create an admin router that's going to be in the admin.js file under routes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create that new file, admin.js. And this needs to look a lot like the other routers that we had before. Oops. There we go. So it has to look a lot like the other routes that we had before. When we're getting this, we're getting the admin listing. So this is at the root of the admin. So this is a path relative to that admin directory. Okay, so it kind of looks like the root of our web application. I don't want you to think that that is what it is, because we've already defined the template being, or the route being /admin. Now from /admin, that's really what this routing template is saying. From there, well, I'm just talking about the root of the admin directory. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to render out admin, and the title is going to be the admin homepage. And then because I'm rendering out admin, what I want to do is I want an admin view template. So I'm going to say I want a new file, which is going to be admin.pug. And again, I'm going to extend layout. And then I want a block for the content. And then in here, I want an h1 tag that's going to say, this is the admin homepage. Okay, and I think that should be all I have to do. So now I'm going to users, I'm going to switch over to admin, and you can see that I'm getting to the admin homepage. Okay, now, in order to clean this up a little bit, what I want to do is, if I actually look at these routes are going to get kind of messy. And ideally, what I'd like to do is this route file should really just be the routes. So, for instance, right now I'm going to admin, but maybe I want to be able to do an admin list, an admin create, an admin update, and so all sorts of different functionality. And I would have to define that all in here, and I'm going to have those function definitions all in here. So this routes file ends up looking a little bit messy. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called controllers. And within the controllers folder, I'm going to have a new file called admin controller. Okay, and the idea here is that I'm going to export the home page, and the home page is really me receiving a request and generating a response. So this is how I'm going to handle the home page. And really what I want to do here is I want to take the response and I want to render, and we're talking about the admin controller, so how would we render the admin controller's homepage? We want to render this admin file. Okay, so this is fairly simple for the controller, but that also simplifies our routes. So now if I come back over to admin, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want a variable for my admin controller, which is equal to require. And I'm in the routes directory, and I got to go into the controllers, so I'm going to move up a directory into the controllers, and then I want the admin controller. Okay, so I have a reference to that admin controller, and then what's going to happen is I'm not using this function anymore. This function is what got exported, where I render out the admin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the admin controller, and this was the homepage function definition. Okay, so I've abstracted that function over to the admin controller. And one thing I forgot to do is I forgot to set the title. So the title is going to be the admin homepage. Okay, so I'm using that function from my admin controller to respond to this specific path. Okay, so now if I come back over, ideally it should work exactly the same way. Okay, so now if I want to add another route, okay, so if I want to add another route, what I might do is I might come in and say, okay, this router might get the admin directory's add. Then I want to go into the admin controller and have an add function. Okay, so then I can go to the admin controller and I can say exports add. It's going to take a request and a response. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to send a message saying adding. Okay, so this isn't very exciting. I'm not even using view templating or anything like that. I'm just saying that we have a new route defined. And where that's going to come into play is if I go to admin/add. Now you'll see that I'm getting that new location. And the idea here is that my routing files define the different paths that are available for administrators. So I could have the root, I could have add, I could have delete, I could have list, I could have update. All of those would be fairly straightforward, right? So I could just repeat these, delete, update, list, and again, I probably want corresponding methods in my controller. But those function definitions for what should actually happen to render out those pages will then fall into my admin controller file. And then the idea there is maybe I'm sharing some stuff, right? So maybe when I delete and when I update, I have a method to find a course by ID or find a user by ID, right? So I might share that method. I might have a function definition and then that function definition could get shared across both my delete and my update. Okay, even though it's not defined in any of these paths, I have this controller file that may share that method definition. Okay, so my route file ends up getting cleaned up. My controller file ends up getting some advantages in that I get to share some code. All of it's just a kind of a better organized application. Okay, so last week the conversation shifted to what if I have an API using Express, and in that API we have kind of mimicking an education university. There might be a table of courses, there might be a table of students, there might be a table of registrations, so all sorts of different stuff. And if I'm going to build an API that has CRUD methods for all of those, really I want to have different routes. So it might be like API/courses, API/students, API/registrations. Really, this is how we're going to end up doing it, is we'd have different routes that would be defined. Okay, so the starting point for route definition is in your app.js file. We say, okay, here's the different paths that we're going to handle. But then once we get to that path, we're basically handing it off to one of our routers. Okay, so with admin, we kind of built that out manually. So we're handing off any requests that come to that admin path. So if our URL is localhost:3000/admin, then we're handing that request off to the admin router. And then once we get to the admin router, we have different HTTP verbs. And again, we're handling it through the URL for the verbs. I personally would rather handle it this way. Right? So I'll actually attach the HTTP verbs to the router and then handle those requests differently. But the way I initially set it up was all of these were going to be HTTP gets, and then we're just rendering out different web pages. And realistically, this is not working. So I say this is not working because we added the add functionality to admin controller. So there's an add, but there is no delete, there is no update, there is no list. So what's going to happen is we're going to try to execute that. We're going to try to go to the list, and you'll see that the site can't be reached. And what happens is then I have to look at the console to see what actually happened. Okay, so it crashed when I got to that route. It said throw a new error, and I get object undefined, and eventually I track it down to admin.js. Okay, on line 8. And if I go to admin.js on line 8, what we're really looking at is finally I get to this delete method, and that's where I'm running into a problem because I don't have this delete method defined in my admin controller. Okay, so this is just kind of an initial glance at how I might build out a full-scale application using Express and Node.js and having kind of that whole model view controller architecture to generate kind of a full-scale application within Node.js.